All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this morning's webinar, examining the risks associated with remote work. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of quick ground rules for today's presentation. All attendees will be placed on mute for the duration of the webinar. Should you have any questions throughout this webinar, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar panel, and we will do our best to get those questions answered or reach out to you afterwards. We did get a number of questions sent in before the webinar that we tried to build into the presentation, and a couple that we'll address out at the end. So at this point, I'd like to hand things over to Frank Nemia to begin today's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. As Jared just mentioned, my name is Frank Nemia, and I'm the Risk Advisory Practice Leader here at Bloom. I want to welcome all of you to our webinar today. As I may quote a Twitter spokesperson, opening offices will be our decision. When and if our employees come back will be theirs. And Jared, if you could just move that slide. Thank you. In March, many companies were simply unprepared when they were required to send their employees home to begin to work remotely. It's safe to say that many assumed risks that would counter their risk management strategy. Now, as organizations look forward to a new operating model, they need to reassess the risks they assumed and may have missed and develop a complementary mitigation strategy. Next slide, please. The objectives of our webinar today will be to identify risks that come with working from home and reimagining how you can manage it effectively and securely, address key areas to consider as you transition from a stay-at-home to a telework hybrid model, break down the risks associated with telework, offer insights into best practices to keep your organization safe, and finally, discuss how Bloom can help you assess and mitigate the risks of your remote work strategy. Our presenters today include Heather Beerfield, Jeff Ciplo, Christine Demina, David Nowacki, and Eric Brown. They bring years of experience in assisting clients in identifying and mitigating many of the risks that will be discussed today. Each presenter will discuss one of the following areas: business continuity, bringing the office to your employees, process and procedures, protecting your organization, and finally, managing compliance and third parties. It's now my pleasure to introduce Christine Demina to discuss business continuity. Christine.
Thank you, Frank. Companies have been forced to quickly transition to a remote work environment, regardless of their level of preparedness or robustness of a business continuity plan. As everyone was forced off-site, reliance was placed on existing plans, whether they were formalized and tested, informal, or newly developed. Key focus areas of business continuity are business continuity and resilience, and processes and responsibilities. Both carry their own unique risks and impacts to a company. Business continuity is a proactive plan to avoid and mitigate risks associated with a disruption of operations. It details steps to be taken before, during, and after an event to ensure that business operations can be continued and sustained when working remotely. A robust business continuity plan should also address the risk of data loss and have an established process to protect and recover data. Businesses cannot operate without access to critical data and information. Key processes and controls are very likely to be impacted by a sudden change to a remote work environment. Deficiencies that existed prior to a business interruption event can be magnified greatly and exposed in the transition. Employees may not be prepared to perform key duties remotely, leading to a breakdown in controls, lack of segregation of duties, and increased opportunities for fraud or error. Changes to processes should be documented, tracked, and reviewed to ensure a proper control structure remains in place. Lack of cross-training can also impact a company's ability to do business if employees are ill or unable to work. Next slide, please. There are many questions to start thinking about when assessing the current level of risk exposure. Are formal business continuity and disaster recovery plans established? If so, when were they last updated? Have they ever been tested? Many companies who thought they had comprehensive plans have discovered there were gaps when all operations had to move off-site. It is important to assess these plans and update them for any changes needed since the pandemic began. Employee counts have been reduced through layoffs and furloughs. How did companies determine the critical or essential employees that needed to be connected to keep the business running smoothly? Did these employees have access to the appropriate equipment and technology? Accurate procedure manuals and job descriptions can ensure that essential employees are properly equipped to perform key duties remotely. With reductions in employee counts and the switch to remote work, key processes have changed. Have these changes been documented and approved? Are employees cross-trained on critical processes? Companies should be able to support changes to the control environment with proper documentation, approvals, and consideration of segregation of duties. Employees should be cross-trained in critical processes in case of illness or the inability of employees to remotely perform their jobs. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Eric to share a war story.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Christine. Hello, my name is Eric Brown. I'm a consultant in the risk advisory practice here at Bloom. And one of my roles here is also performing breach remediation. So when a company gets affected by something like cryptographic malware and they can no longer access their files, I go in with a team of other Bloom Shapiro consultants and we try to get the environment back up and running as soon as possible. The first thing that I always ask for when I got on site is, how good is your last backup? Is the first question I always ask. And generally, if the companies have a backup that's good within a couple of days, we can get them up and running pretty quickly. However, recently we encountered one where it was a medium-sized company with approximately 100 employees. They did not have a good, consistent backup when the cryptographic malware attack happened. So what we essentially had to do was the company had to eventually pay the ransom, which was unfortunate and could have been avoided if they had had a good backup. And the other piece of it was because of the nature of the breach itself, we wound up having to recreate the environment from scratch, which is also time consuming and very costly to the client. So again, having a good backup is a terrific part of a DR strategy for your company. Jared, next slide, please. So the three areas of focus I'm going to be addressing here is the virtualization environment, file storage and document management, and managed services around your infrastructure. As we have all been forced to transition to work remotely, remote office environments have been constructed hastily to get business operations up and running as quickly as possible. Many companies did not have a plan to accommodate their entire workforce to be remote all at the same time. And if they did, the plan had probably never been fully tested. Because these plans were not developed ahead of time, companies were forced to institute these programs without going through the proper procedures for deploying and securing their data properly. This applies to both virtualization, file storage, and document management. Both carry similar risks and impacts to the company. Managed service providers also bring specific risks into the environment. However, those risks remain the same whether you're running your IT environment internally or have it outsourced to a third party. Deploying a virtual environment with data and file sharing presents these specific challenges. Not having the proper access control procedures in place prior or during the deployment of these environments is also an issue. This puts internal data at risk. As an example, who now has access to sensitive data, such as HR data? Is there a document that we could all look at that demonstrates who has access to what data? This type of exercise is important only because we want to make sure that we keep track of who is accessing what data, where, and when. The other issue with deploying an environment quickly is not having the correct team or resources for deployment. It's very difficult to do this during a crisis. Conducting a pre-assessment engagement to determine resource constraints and a way to optimize the environment is also a challenge. The primary bottleneck for a lot of companies right now is their internet access is not able to handle the load of a full remote workforce accessing all at the same time. Another specific issue to the virtualization of an environment, it does not have enough resources to guarantee a satisfying end user experience. Another issue would be the security program is not clearly defined. So patching equipment and the virtualization environment is not being done on a regular basis. This also has to do with your managed services provider to make sure that they are also patching your operating systems on a regular basis and your third-party applications to make sure that these activities are taking place. A typical security program should also address the risk of data exfiltration and have an established process to alert of these types of activities to mitigate the risk. Businesses shouldn't operate without a security program to consistently look for threats internally and externally in real time and report on these types of issues on a regular basis. Slide 2, please, Jared. So how do we address this? When was the last time you ran an external scan against anything in your company that connects to the internet? There may be things that have an internet connection that may surprise you, such as air conditioning, climate control systems, camera systems, old servers that are still directly connected to the internet, and things of that nature. So the best way to mitigate the risk of all this is to institute a security program with a Chief Information Security Officer position to manage and report against these types of threats or technical issues on a regular basis that is reviewed by senior management. If you put such a program in place, it ensures that your managed services provider is also providing all the services that they're obligated to provide for you, along with the security of that environment. Also, if you review this on a regular basis with everybody involved in the IT environment and management of it, it's less likely that you will be caught exposed for any of these types of risks. So now I'm going to hand it over to David Nowacki.
Hello, my name is David Nowacki, and I work in the risk advisory practice as well for Bloom Shapiro. I'm going to talk about processes and procedures, and I think this is one of the most vitally important things to discuss with your employees, managers, and staff throughout the organization as we get into the wake of this pandemic and the rapid deployment of a virtual workforce, and looking at what that looks like going forward. The three areas of focus are teleworking policies and procedures, managing teleworker productivity and monitoring them, and then your HR employment relations practices. And so many organizations either have not fully embraced telework, have partially embraced telework, or haven't, updated a teleworker policy or procedure or program up until now. And so this has kind of forced us to do some things on the fly, much like some of the business continuity comments and technology comments that were given previously. Some of the risks and impacts are, what are the guidelines for how your employees are working? How are you managing them? How are you scheduling them? What does that say about your day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month activities? And is it still up in the air, or have you started to document what it'll look like as we move forward and start to bring people back? Things like who can work from home. And I think the new reality has got to be something to the effect of if employees are making things, managing things, or fixing physical things, they need to be on site. Otherwise, there's some subjective criteria that you need to start to put in place in terms of your policies and procedures that says, who can work. If they can work remote, you need to consider that as a pretty strong criteria for enabling a remote workforce or a position to be working and managed remotely as well. Risks like productivity loss, employees taking advantage of time off, or just not being able to do the work that they're scheduled. So how are you managing and prioritizing tasks? How are you ensuring check-ins? How are you measuring success? A risk related to the employment experience that's in a traditional office setting can't extend adequately to a virtual environment. Your value proposition to your employees, the services you provide to them, if you're not able to extend that to the work environment, you may have a bigger issue with loss of employees, turnovers, employee relations turning sour, et cetera, et cetera. Jared, can you advance the slide? So some of the questions to ask, one, have you adopted or updated policies and procedures for telework arrangements? Telework arrangements often cover the who is eligible, what their expectations are. It may also have expectations for a safe work environment at home, safety and security of your environment. If they're outside the walls of your building, you don't have control and there's some risk. So making sure that they understand what safety precautions need to be in place to ensure that they are safe and stable, but also things like at-home security checklists. They're connecting to your network in many cases or your systems, and so you make sure that you are outlining expectations for what that looks like at a minimum for your employees to be minimizing the risk to your organization. Do your employees understand expectations for communication and acceptable behavior and performance? Are you looking at ways to put information in a dashboard or a prioritization list, or leveraging things like Microsoft Office 365 or Teams, some of the newer technologies that allow you to prioritize tasks, put them in one spot, and have your entire team and your managers start to manage the productivity and manage the goals and the performance, and not just manage the people and expect that them being in an office setting means they're productive. And so I think this gives you an opportunity to transform how you manage employees in your workforce and productivity, and really set out some meaningful metrics based upon the type of position that they have, and enabling it to be in a spot that's accessible by all. Have managers been trained? Have staff been trained to ensure accountability? There's an inverse risk to this as well, which is overbearing managers who may be checking in too frequently, or micromanaging, or calling their employees too often. And really, you need to embrace adaptable, agile management techniques. Perhaps that means a huddle at the beginning of the week, a recap at the end of the day, periodic check-ins that are scheduled, but enables your employees to go about their day as they need to, but still be productive. And so training, I think, is important on next generation remote virtual collaboration and management techniques. Are you actually leveraging communication techniques that are available to you. Instant messaging, cloud technologies, prioritization boards where you have work items that are outlined for each employee each day and allow you to have status check-ins. Have you looked at technology from a communications perspective and say, how can we do better? Not just phone calls, not just email, but leveraging newer age technologies. And I think that one of the bigger things is the whole employment experience. So how are we looking at that life cycle of an employee? Are they feeling the same thing from you? So whether it's your protocols and procedures to attract and select talent, to your onboarding, perhaps embrace this opportunity to push all of your onboarding and routine activities, policy sign-offs and required training, push that all to the cloud where you may have manual forms. And I think the bigger thing is, how are you engaging with them, checking in with them, developing them and managing them? This all needs to be in a virtual environment today. Otherwise, you're going to have this deterioration of your employers or your employees' perception of you when you aren't in the office space. And I think it's a critical area where you need to look at your life cycle of your how you're managing employees and basically build in virtualization and telework into your strategies today, so you can attract and maintain your current employees, but also attract the talent of the future. Right now, I'd like to hand it off to Jeff Ziplow to talk about how you can protect your organization.
So I apologize, everyone. When you start talking and you forget to unmute, so that was me just now. Thank you, David. I do appreciate that. I think just by way of background, this is Jeff Ziplow, one of the partners in the risk advisory practice area. It's really important when we talk about telework to talk about how we can protect your organization. Users our employees were thrown into a situation and they adapted quickly or had to adapt quickly. And the areas of focus that I'd like to talk about is the security, monitoring, phishing, training, and talking about the employee from a little bit different perspective than what David was talking about. Really, how do your employees help protect the organization as a whole? Employees, as we know, can be the first line of defense, and they can be, your greatest asset. They can help to escalate incidents quickly, identify incidents quickly. They can help to influence coworkers by word of mouth, by texting, and they can also provide, training to others as needed. Some of the risks that we're seeing in this area is in a couple of buckets, if you will. The home PC security features, we've migrated a lot to the home. Are our employees using home computers, or are they using computers that came from the office? And I'll get into a little bit more detail on that. But one of the areas that we're seeing phishing attacks on are actually from the attackers are posing as that company's IT department. And so they'll go through a spear phishing attack. They'll share with the employee that they're part of the firm's IT department and that they need to obtain their credentials to do something. And the employee at home needs to be aware that these attacks are occurring on a very regular basis. Other types of phishing attacks are occurring on a regular basis. And they need to be aware that they should never, ever, ever provide any type of credentials to anyone, even if it truly is your internal IT department. The IT department shouldn't be asking for credentials. There are other ways for them to access or provide information to the employee if need be. Another critical risk and area to discuss is company data. Now that I'm working at home, now that I have access to information, where am I storing this data? Am I storing it locally on my home computer? Am I storing it on a thumb drive because I think I'm going to be transferring data that way? Or are we ensuring that the data is being stored on the company network? And what's really important here is those protocols and standards need to be put in place, and employees need to be trained on where information should and needs to be stored. By teleworking, we've actually increased the threat surface exponentially, if you think about it, because each employee who's working from home has their own mini network. And yes, we had employees doing some work at home, but certainly not the majority of our employees. And now we've just exponentially increased that threat surface to the employees' network at home and how they access their network through hopefully their office PC and not their home PC. But again, we need to consider that and understand the security concerns and threats that come along with that. And then looking at communications and certainly how we're doing video conferencing these days. I know a number of organizations quickly jump to different types of teleconferencing solutions, Zoom being one, Teams being another, Google solution being another. Yet we kind of just jumped to it. We didn't understand the implications, the security risks and concerns. I know there were a number of organizations that moved on to Zoom, and there's no issues with Zoom per se, but there was something called Zoom bombing, where we had people who got engaged in a video conference that was not part of, that was not originally invited, and different things would happen in those situations. And protecting our organization is really taking a step back and understanding these areas of security, of phishing, of threat attacks that are coming against us increasingly, and understanding how we can mitigate or minimize those types of threats. On the next slide, what you'll see is some real questions to ask, and these are imperative to protecting your organization. Without a doubt, all organizations should have a VPN, or a virtual private network. So if I'm working at home and I'm accessing the network, or I'm using information off of our network, there should be a VPN in place. And what that VPN does is, even though I'm using the public internet, it's actually creating what's known as a tunnel, a VPN tunnel that can securely create a connection between my location and the office location. And creating that VPN tunnel helps to mitigate any types of attacks that could or would occur if it were not put in place. The implementing MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. Now more than ever, we need to have multi-factor authentication in place, and we need to be using it in all ways possible. Multi-factor authentication is some type of, it's a validation, if you will. It's something you know, something plus something you have. So typically the way it works is that I want to access a system. It knows that, or it thinks it knows that it's Jeff Ziplow who's accessing the system. And so it's going to come back and it's going to send me either a text message, it's going to, on a mobile app, it's going to have allow me to approve that access, or it's actually going to give me a phone call. But in any one of those instances, I have to validate that, yes, it is Jeff Ziplow who is accessing that particular application. And MFA, multi-factor authentication, is really important to implement in all situations. We see this a lot, if you will, with with banks and financial institutions. We're asked those standard questions, if you will. What is your pet's name, or where'd you go to high school? One of the things we really need to consider in those instances is we shouldn't be using responses if we are asked a challenged question like that. The response should be something that is readily available on social media, because most people have access to social media, and responding with where I went to high school, I can find out immediately on social media, on the internet. So typically what we recommend, this is a tips and tricks component of our webinar today, is put in something that doesn't make any sense, like blue jumping jacks as your challenge question response. That's certainly not out on social media. Training is really important. Training our employees to understand the types of attacks that are happening, the types of things that they should and shouldn't respond to. And I always use the phrase, stop, think, and then react. And our employees need to be trained to do that: stop, think, and react. Regarding the PC that's being used by the teleworker, hopefully it is an office PC laptop that has been appropriately configured, that has been secured. And the reason that I say hopefully is, if our employees are using their home computers, we really don't know what standards exist. It's really not a good idea, because we don't know if they have up-to-date virus protection software. We don't know if their computer may already be infected. We don't know if their system is fully patched. And so because of all of those things, we should develop protocols where employees are only using those computers that have been provided by the company and that we know have the appropriate security protocols within them. One of the things you probably want to share with your employees is, they have, and most, if not all, employees have their own, home firewalls, their own home routers, but it's important to have a discussion with them. And again, I think it goes back to training as to how we can ensure that the default user ID and password on those devices are changed. We've seen a number of situations where people didn't recognize or realize that default user IDs and passwords still exist on home routers. So anyone could be sitting outside of your house and actually gain access to your home router by changing the administrative password or going in under the default administrative password. And now they have access and control and can put malware, on your devices that are connected up to the home router. Securing and making sure that patches are applied appropriately, I think, are very important. And then let's take a step back and take a look at our communications platform and make sure that we know how to secure them, how to effectively maintain them, and put in place good business practices so that we don't get Zoom bombed in the future, and that we know how to effectively use those particular tools in a secure manner. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Heather Beerfield and have her talk on her topic.
Excellent, thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to be speaking on managing compliance and third parties. This actually is an extremely important topic for us to be discussing today. All of the areas that we've been talking about today are things that should be happening as the transition occurs. And as far as the compliance and third-party risk, that seems to be something that's really falling to the wayside, that we've been seeing and hearing a lot from our clients. Obviously, there's many reasons for this, why that's occurring. Initially, because the transition had to occur so rapidly. Everyone was focused on getting the business up and running, making sure that processes and procedures were in place, and just that everything as smooth a transition as possible. Sometimes the vendor's role didn't necessarily change, but from a compliance perspective, that was a completely different story. So we were working with a lot of organizations to understand, did they transition appropriately in response to the regulations that they have to adhere to? What types of controls are in place and how are those changing? The other thing is that a lot of the individuals in the organizations that we work with who were maintaining compliance have taken on other roles and are identifying other factors that they have to deal with from a risk perspective during the transition. That rapid transition, certainly led to a lot of gaps as far as controls are concerned. This was due to it being new to employees working remotely. So the job and the procedures have changed drastically. So there are gaps within that transition of where potentially risks weren't being identified and covered sufficiently. And this was not due to anything from a malintent. It was just simply due to either lack of knowledge and a learning curve and those sorts of things. That whole transition that took place is almost impossible as well to ensure that it was done in compliance and every single employee knew exactly what controls they were responsible for, and also that they were also adhering to them appropriately as well. The other thing that happens is that a lot of times, we'll sit down and our organizations will go through what third parties are going to be providing exactly as far as services, service level agreements, a detailed list of uptimes or monitoring or things of that nature. These types of managed service providers especially have had an overflow of requests coming through because all of their clients have had to transition and they all have the same types of risks, worries, those sorts of things. So this overflow as far as the work is concerned really sometimes left some of the companies that we're working with and we're hearing from in a position where they weren't sure of what level of service they were going to be provided, and also any of the controls that they're putting in place to ensure that security was properly protected and their information was identified as well. Having said that as well, a large risk is that given the remote work environment, and this is, a lot of people have mentioned this a little bit during the presentation as well, but identifying where that data is stored and identifying what is critical data and communicating that to not only all of your employees, but communicating how to protect that information as well. There's a huge risk of privacy concerns going on due to a lack, obviously, of employees' knowledge, but also due to a lack of knowing and really understanding what is critical data and how it's actually being classified. So on top of trying to transition your business, you're also trying to ensure that not only your vendors are protecting your information, that you're still in compliance with any regulations that you have to adhere to, but also ensuring the privacy of the information and that your employees and vendors are aware of the criticality and nature of the information that they have access to. Having the ability to store it on different networks now, such as a home network or a home PC, obviously opens up an entire can of worms as far as vulnerabilities are concerned. It is obviously impossible for an organization, given the quick transition time, to have gone to everybody's home office and ensure that their level of encryption and protection was, adhering to the organization's level that they are pushed out as far as their policies and procedures are concerned. And Jeff had spoken to that a little bit as well, but it does cause a huge area of concern for organizations in trying to understand from a remote perspective and get a good grasp on what people are doing at home and how the controls are sufficiently in place. Jared, if you could go to the next slide, please. So the biggest area of concern that we're seeing is there's so many different manual controls. So when you're in an office, you can either walk over, get a wet signature. You can walk into the office and get a verbal approval for some of the controls, have it written down, those sorts of things, but those all have to be modified now. So what do organizations do who don't have a software package like DocuSign or something of that nature? How have they been able to implement those manual controls, and how are they offering a level of protection against that? So these are all areas that we have to think about. The other part of that transition is that those are controls that have been altered and changed. So without having done any sort of assessment around your compliance program, how do you know that what has been implemented is in compliance with the program? Now, we talk, and I just being completely honest, obviously, I don't think that regulators are going to come in right away, with a heavy hand and say, okay, show me your compliance program. How did you transition? Make sure you are in compliance with everything. But I do think it's going to be a major area of focus, given the fact of the work environment and how much it has changed from what it was before. So if you have a SOC report, or if you're, have to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, it really is going to have a great impact on your organization, not only in your report, but the results of your report as well, because organizations themselves have been trying to make this transition to what controls actually should be in place, what they should be look like, what the design is. And sometimes the design is there, but the operating effectiveness is hard to achieve when it was all done in the office. So those are things that have to be taken into consideration, and that's what we're getting a lot of questions on, is how do we take this one manual control, and how do we transition it into a control that can be performed remotely and securely and in compliance and operating effectively. So I think now that everyone's kind of settled in at home as far as the remote work environment is concerned, it really is the time to ensure that you perform, a top to bottom compliance risk assessment. Go through all of your control sets, ensure that they are in compliance as far as what's been implemented, and not only from an internal perspective, but also from this vendor third-party perspective. The thing about vendors and third-party risk is you do obviously have individuals who own that relationship, but we've seen so many times that it's the reason for having these relationships is that so you can transition kind of responsibility and the day-to-day detail of it. People take that to a large extent, and we've seen many of our clients fall into a place where they've been so reliant on their vendor or third-party provider that the services that they have outsourced are actually being provided for them. There's been a couple of cases, in the not so distant future past, that they had outsourced the security monitoring and incident response and all of those procedures. So they were getting reports every day thinking that they were really monitoring their vendor and having that oversight that they needed, but the reports were coming back clean every day. And as everybody on this call knows, you aren't going to get a clean report every day from an incident perspective. There had been a breach in that time and they had no data to go off of. So what, that oversight piece is really, really imperative. And especially from the security side, from the IT perspective, if it is being outsourced and you're the individual that is kind of ultimately responsible for monitoring that relationship, now more than ever is the time to ensure that they are providing the services that they're stating that they are. We can't let that slide. The other piece is that we tend to fall, and a lot of the organizations tend to fall in just completely relying on them without even understanding how our vendors have transitioned. What controls change for them? Where are their vulnerabilities? Do their vulnerabilities affect us? Does it pose a threat to our organization? And there hasn't been enough time to fully document that, have an assessment performed of it. So organizations are kind of flying blind with their vendors as far as how strong their control environments are. Because again, if you're looking at a SOC report, or if you're looking at compliance with any number of regulations such as HIPAA or GLBA or FedRAMP or ISO, or you name it, that transition time has been such a short window at this point that there really hasn't been able to have a third party come in and assess what their control environment looks like. Just like there hasn't been enough time at all of our organizations as well to have that happen. So our clients and all organizations are kind of at a disadvantage right now, given the short window and the large extent of changes that have occurred at each and every organization. So I think you'll see the trend be in the next 6 to 8 months, that ask for those compliance reports and the compliance risk assessments, the attestations over internal controls are going to drastically increase, because no one has any assurance from either, again, vendors, third parties within their own organizations that that transition actually occurred smoothly. There hasn't been enough time to make that assessment on the internal control environment. The other piece is, do we really understand what each of our vendors and third parties have access to as far as our data is concerned? I mean, prior to the remote work, it may have been documented, and if it was, that's excellent. But we've also seen that our vendors and third parties are being asked to do more and perform more services for us. Does that give them further insight to our data? Were they only, running backups for us? Now are they coming in? Are they helping manipulate data? Are they helping manipulate reports? Are they, how has the scope of their services changed? And that has a huge impact, obviously, on the data. Again, that brings us back to, okay, what was their transition? What were their vulnerabilities? So if that criticality of data actually increases and their access to it also increases, we need to take that into consideration in our internal risk assessments and understand that poses a threat to the organizations. We've seen also too that many of our clients have, again, asked for more, yet are those, especially managed service organizations, are just being bombarded, obviously, with requests and saying, okay, get us up and running, get us up and running, get us up and running from a remote perspective. But it's more focused on keep the shop open, get the operations running, and not necessarily the first thought being privacy or security of that data, but more as an afterthought. It was really operations first, and then, okay, let's see how we can secure it. And how do we know during that time that there hasn't been a breach or any sort of manipulation of data from an internal perspective, whether it be from a malintent or if it's just, a user error? There used to be obviously a lot of reports that would trigger those things. Are we monitoring them as closely as they used to? Are our vendors monitoring them as closely as they used to? A lot of those policies and procedures, as David were talking about, has obviously changed. And it's not just, again, for our organizations. So the other thing that we also come in contact with when we talk with a lot of our prospects and things is that many of them sometimes are unaware of all the regulations, especially from an IT perspective, that they need to be in compliance with. Whether that be from a state level, a federal level, an industry level, what are the requirements that have to be in place? So even having that knowledge of what those are really goes a long way to ensure that you can be in adherence with them. And again, people think that their vendors are aware of all of them. Sometimes they're not, depending obviously on the services that they provide. They're just thinking about those services, and their jobs are not necessarily to ensure that they're in compliance with that regulation that your organization has to adhere to. So these are all questions that we really need to start thinking about and asking and digging down deep, because again, we're going to see that trend where people are going to be asking for these reports and saying, okay, show me your transition securely. Where can you prove to me that there was no room for a breach to occur, or it was minimized and mitigated as much as it possibly could? And now our data is being protected. And even during that transition to the remote workforce, how it was being protected. How do you ensure that at your own organizations as well? And what impact does that have on ours? So it really has a big impact. I mean, vendor risk and compliance was really on the rise even before any of this happened. It was something that, all organizations should have been rating their vendors. Their one vendor should be being assessed on an annual basis, and so on and so forth down the line. And I think, that's one of the things where the ball has been dropped in this transition and the chaos that has ensued. So it needs to come to the forefront again. It is something that's ultimately important. And again, it's something that even if your organization itself has taken all the necessary steps to protect information and mitigate threats of data breaches, train your employees from a security awareness perspective to also minimize those threats. The vendor and third party, again, in a blink of an eye, anything that could happen to your organization could happen there. And so having that trust in the assessment and evidence of their smooth transition and their strong, secure transition, not only of their operations, but of your data as well, is ultimately important. So make sure that whoever is in charge at your organizations for this, not only your compliance, but your vendor relationships, is really on top of that and understanding what and how all of your vendors have changed. Your vendors have changed and your control sets have changed. And I think that we have some questions that we're going to address now at this time. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I'm heading it over back. I'm sorry, Frank, to wrap it up.
Thank you, Heather. It's our hope that today the presenters have been able to provide you with some additional insight regarding the key areas and risks of the telework strategy. At a minimum, we hope the content was thought-provoking. You may have some questions as to whether you have properly designed and developed the control environment that addresses the inherent risks and is operating both effectively and efficiently. Through our telework risk assessment service, our practice can assist you in assessing the design of your controls and test their operating effectiveness. The methodology is a three-phased approach that allows us to assist you to look at the entire process or specific areas of concern and provide you with a remediation roadmap if required. Please feel free to contact any of our team members if you are interested in learning more about the service and how it can benefit you. Before I turn it over to Jared, who will conduct a short feedback poll and our team to answer your previously submitted questions, I first would like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend the webinar today and wish you and your families a safe Memorial Day weekend. Jared, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Frank. As Frank mentioned, we're just going to launch a quick poll question here to just gauge the audience opinion here about the areas of risk that were discussed today and which ones you guys on the call, everyone, is most concerned about. So that poll is up now. These are anonymous votes, so feel free to vote in this poll that we've launched, and then we'll leave that open for about 30 seconds and then get to some of your questions. Great, getting a lot of votes here, so just give it another few seconds here. Great, thank you, everybody. Now to go over a couple questions that have come in. So the first question here is how to maintain data security with regard to equipment, internet service, and insurance.
Eric, did you want to address that, or David?
Sure. So Jared, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, the question was how to maintain data security with regard to equipment, internet service, and then insurance is the last component there.
Okay. Well, for the two pieces of the question that are regard equipment and internet, really the best way to ensure that you're securing those environments appropriately is to have a defined security program. So one of the things that we do is we offer Chief Information Security Officer services as a fractional component. So if you're not a large company, you can rent a Chief Information Security Officer, so to speak, on a fractional basis. And this will enable you to establish a program where you could look at everything, your internet connections from the outside, your data connections on the inside, produce reports, look for any kind of risks or anything that needs to be mitigated that way. And if you start to look at all these things over time on a monthly basis, it's much more difficult to make a mistake or experience a breach, because this will, certainly assist with that. And if you are also utilizing that type of service, this should also give you a substantial break on your insurance costs with regard to breach insurance or cybersecurity insurance.
Thanks, Eric. David, I think this question is for you. Are there objective criteria out there for determining who is eligible to work from home?
Yeah, I think the operative word is objective, and I don't think we're in an objective state of our work environment right now. I think it's, in the short term, it's very subjective. I mentioned in my segment, if you have employees who work with physical things, so you're machining or you're creating or managing an office environment, If you create, manage, fix physical things, I think those individuals, you're hard pressed to justify working remote, purely remote. You can have flexible work arrangements, but purely remote is probably off the table. And others, I think you need to assume if they can work from home, if the position enables it, if your employees are accountable, your managers know how to manage and prioritize, that you need to consider them a candidate for that. And so I think the objectivity comes in your own internal policies, given your environment, your industry, what labor relations look like for you, and exempt versus non-exempt status. But I think it's entirely subjective in the short term.
And David, I think I'll send this one to you too, but I'll open it up to anyone else. I know in your section that you presented on, you talked about some of the productivity monitoring options. What are your thoughts on tracking programs for computers of people who are working remotely? And does that backfire on employers at all? Do you get into any sort of invasion of privacy issues there? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the old adage, trust but verify, right? So I don't think you need to be overbearing. As long as your policies and procedures cover the right to monitor, I don't think you need to monitor internet activity, phone use, instant messaging use, and track and trace everything. If you have a breach of trust, maybe you ratchet that back a little bit. But I think it's better to establish expectations for check-ins, for reporting, and making sure your managers are working with their employees to know what expectations they have. And this comes down to base level communication that we've had a paradigm shift in. It can't just be drop into the office. You can't be overbearing with instant messenger or emails. I think you need to schedule and intentionally manage and direct your employees and allow them to help define success from an activity perspective, from a performance perspective, from a time on the clock and responsiveness perspective as well.
And David, you're a popular guy today, and I think this one goes right on in the lines of what you were just talking about. Would you have any advice for determining areas that companies should measure to help manage that productivity, other than say just tracking time spent on phone calls, for instance?
Yeah, I think we need to get away from the concept of time as a barometer for success, because an 8-hour day doesn't mean an 8-hour worth of productivity or widget making or reporting or summarizing or working on cases. If you work in social services, for example, I think you need to look at what the work is. How do you determine progress? So whether it's a yes, no, complete and a number or volume measure, or it's check-ins or phasing on the development of something that's a little bit longer term, you need to be able to outline what that is. And Jared, I don't have a specific example for you, but I think we could probably put together a broader webinar to delve into this a bit more. What performance measurement and monitoring means in a post-COVID hybrid teleworking state.
Great, David. Thank you for that. And I think that wraps the questions that we've gotten. I will just provide an answer to a question that was very common that I saw coming in throughout the webinar, and that is, yes, everyone will receive a copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar. That'll go out shortly following the webinar once everything is done processing. But you will be receiving a copy of the slides and the recording here. So again, just thank you to everyone for joining us today. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to a member of the team, and feel free to visit the Bloom Shapiro coronavirus resource page that will help answer a lot of questions in this area. That's bloomshapiro.com/coronavirus. Thank you again, everybody, and have a good weekend.